Hey everybody, Bob Crossan, Senior Managing Editor from Water and Waste Digest. And throughout this whole month of January, I'm going to be talking with some thought leaders on policy, regulations, legislation, all that kind of thing. So today I have with me Stephen Greenhut. He is a journalist and the Western Region Director for R Street Institute. He is also the author of the book Winning the Water Wars. California can meet its water needs by promoting abundance rather than managing scarcity. And that is what we're going to be talking about today. So Steve, thank you so much for being on the call. We appreciate you taking the time to talk about your book and to also talk a little bit about the things that you've mentioned in this book. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Good to be here.
So the subject of water scarcity is an important one. It's obviously very important out west, but it's not exclusive to the West. But especially in the Colorado River Basin, we understand there's a lot of fighting over water. Could you talk a little bit about why you felt the need to research and look into writing a book like this, and kind of how you went about starting it to even begin with?
Yeah, I mean, I'm out here. I'm based near Sacramento, and I've lived in California for about 22 years, and Southern California also. And when I mentioned to my colleagues back in D.C. or back east about water, you can see their eyes glaze over because water is just something you've got plenty of. Here, obviously, water in the West is one of the big issues the state's always faced since its founding. And we couldn't have a state with nearly 40 million people without some sort of sensible way of capturing water. I mean, California is not a totally arid state, but it's obviously a relatively arid state. And then we have a much more rainfall in the north and the south and distributing that water. So I'm a California geography nut. I've been to every one of our 58 counties. I love the state. I moved here from Ohio, and have always loved the West and California. So in my reporting, mostly for the Orange County Register over the years, I've been this issue just keeps coming up in all sorts of contexts, and it's really an issue that centers on the future of the state. How we're able to meet the needs of a still growing population. We're growing at probably at the lowest rate we've ever grown, less than 0.5% a year, but it's still a large and growing state, and we have to deal with water issues, and we have some of the most productive farmland in the world in the Central Valley, and massive cities. Obviously, this is all obvious stuff, and so it's just inextricably linked with the history of our state and the politics of our state. And it always struck me that like in many things in California, the public policy approaches to water and to growth in general have often been counterproductive. So, my book has a point of view. It's a journalist book written for a regular audience. I argue, as you noted when you read the subtitle, that we need to pursue water abundance, and that issue has gotten it's just gotten pushed to the side as we battle over fish flows and environmental uses and the normal water battles between farm interests and environmental interests and urban interests, and it just seems as if we could have a more constructive way forward. So I thought it was something I always wanted to write about, and Pacific Research Institute, who the publisher of the book, had asked me to write the book, and I just thought it was a way to interconnect all the many topics that I've written about over the years here in California.
Yeah. So in terms of abundance rather than managing scarcity, focusing on the abundance portion, that's totally a frame of mindset. Could you explain what you mean by that to start, just so that we have like that contextually as we're talking about the rest of the comments that you made in the book?
Yeah, the environmentalists like to talk about binaries and how we have to break out of the binary of fighting over fish versus people versus fish, water for urban uses versus ag. But really, I see them as often being the main cause of the binaries, this kind of way of just fighting over water. And my argument through the book, and I look at a variety of ways that we can add abundance, add more water into the system, that should be the focus. And in doing so, we can achieve a lot of things. I mean, we could provide enough water for farms. We can make sure that urban users have plenty of water. But we can also, in that kind of backdrop of having more water into our complicated plumbing system, we can also do a better job taking care, improving habitat. So this isn't a anti-environmental screed by any means. There's nothing wrong with trying to address the environmental issues. But we have a state. We've basically turned the state into a giant plumbing system. We've got the Sierra Nevada mountains with the snowpack, and we have the Central Valley Project, which is the federal water project, and the state water project, and a series of dams. And my problem is that a lot of folks just seem to want more of the state to go back to the wild, and that leads to the endless lawsuits over fish flows. I mean, I tell one story in the book out at New Melones Reservoir out in the Sierra foothills. One of the worst droughts in the state's recorded history. The state
Sorry,
and the
could you say that
feds
again?
were busy. Oh,
Sorry, could you
yes.
say that again? You broke up a little bit.
Oh, sorry about that. At New Melones Reservoir, the state and the feds were essentially emptying the reservoir in the middle of a drought to save, what might have been about a dozen hatchery-raised fish that would have been eaten on the way out to the Pacific. And that seems to be the lunacy that has sometimes dominated our water debates. So my basic premise is that we need to find different ways of adding water into the system during rainy years, so that we have it during dry years, so that we're not left just fighting over fish flows. So a variety of approaches. I talk about new infrastructure projects. I'm not talking about dramatic new dam building, although some dam building, some extension of dams, maintaining our infrastructure, which has been sadly neglected, as we saw at the near catastrophe at Oroville Dam, as well as better water pricing. So water could be bought and sold like any other commodity, and things like water recycling and desalination. Everything has to be evaluated based on costs and benefits. But the focus needs to be on providing more water into the system to serve people, while also maintaining, protecting the environment, not just on this ground war that seems to be fought over water, where it goes, whether it goes to people or to fish. And about 50% of the state's water flows out naturally to the Pacific Ocean. And then 40% goes to ag, and the remainder to commercial and residential uses. So if we put that into perspective, the idea of boosting the amount of water that can be used for human uses becomes a more manageable, almost engineering type solution, rather than a pure, political fight that we have.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing on the political side. It becomes this crazy complex web of interests, right? So not only do you have the residential interests, you mentioned the agricultural ones, you also have things like Silicon Valley and needing water for cooling servers, and commercial interests and stuff like that too, that the complexity increases more and more once this political aspect is drawn into it. Am I mistaken in saying that?
No, that's right. So we have this political backdrop imposed on a complex engineering problem, and my focus is on treating it more like an engineering problem and less like just a political football. The environmental movement is really strong out here, and there are some really reasonable voices in the environmental movement who and I quote some of them, who are talk about ways that we can develop water supply in a more environmentally friendly way. There's totally legitimate. I quote John Muir from his essay on agriculture, where he talked about the wonders of storing water that's captured from the mountains and using it for human uses, more of the old conservation ethic. But there are also environmental groups and activists who file lawsuits against basically any project that would expand water capacity. And there's this strong movement to rid the state of its dams, as many dams as possible, and let more rivers go back to their natural flow. There's broad discussions. I mean, I quote from one of the great books on California water, Cadillac Desert, where the author, talks about allowing more of the state to just go back to nature. And there's a lot of that thinking that drives it. And if the goal is to, allow more of our state to go back to nature and cram us into cities, that's problematic if you want to have a growing state that, what are we, the fifth largest economy in the world, our leaders like to say, even as they do everything they can to make it difficult to maintain that status. So, so my focus is on using things, infrastructure, private water projects, desalination. There's a project in the Mojave Desert that would tap an aquifer the size of Rhode Island, and yet that faces all sorts of political problems. Water recycling is a great approach that Orange County in Southern California has been using. It's really cost effective, and the environmentalists even like that. But a lot of environmentalists use water policy as growth control, and it's not just environmentalists. A lot of folks in our, I've written for newspapers throughout Southern California, and a lot of people, even conservative-minded people, have had enough with growth, and water, it becomes a tool to stop growth. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. So I push back against those kind of ideas.
Yeah, yeah. So when I think about water scarcity, I think because I'm so attuned to things going on in the industry when it comes to water scarcity, I don't think only about arid states. I think about places where water is scarce because your water quality isn't great. Or in the case of like Joliet, so I'm here in Chicago, Joliet, Illinois, they've been tapping a groundwater aquifer for many years, but in the next 10 years, that ground aquifer could dry up and they have no way of getting water distributed out to Joliet. So what happens then? So water scarcity isn't only relegated to the West. How can people look at what's going on in California and apply these engineering solutions that you're talking about to ensure water abundance outside of even just the Western United States? Like what can we do? What can we learn from California and apply at a more national level?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, here in California, and the book is California focused, and we're fighting over fish flows, but we have large segments of the San Joaquin Valley, impoverished areas where they can't eat because of what you're talking about. Similar in Illinois is polluted groundwater that can't be used for drinking water. So I think a political priority that focuses on people and policy that tries to help. I look at like that battle that I had covered in the written about in the book. I mean, it's in terms of California's spending, in terms of dollars and cents, it's a very small problem, and yet it's been dragging on for years, decades actually, and we still have regions that do not have reliable, safe water, mostly, again, poor agricultural regions. So, I don't know anything about the situation in Illinois, but it's true that we that water, taking an approach that focuses on people and trying to create abundance rather than fighting over some of the tangential issues. I mean, we had one case that I wrote about after the book came out. I wrote about it in my newspaper column. There's a battle over a desalination plant near Monterey, and the environmental groups brought out the environmental justice argument to argue against the construction of a desalination plant. But under the current situation, the local rivers are being pumped dry. And California, so it would actually help the environment as well as people if we allowed desalination and some other projects to feed more water into the system. I have a chapter on Israel, which when they have water wars in Israel, the 6-Day War arguably was about water, or at least largely about water. They have actual wars about water, and they've used desalination to essentially fix their problem, and they're able to uh, increase the size of storage in reservoirs using desalinated ocean water. So we're not nearly as arid as Israel, and but the focus is that focus on finding solutions to the lack of water would be a lot more productive than just fighting over every new proposed project.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you bring up Israel because they do have culturally there's a difference there where at a public level, the idea of water scarcity and the concepts around that, the importance of water and their recognition of its value in their daily lives is much different than I feel like a lot of people in the United States who mostly just take it for granted that when they turn on the tap, the water comes out. For so the, I was recently talking to someone about this and on how can we change the culture around water's value in the U.S. and could that be done through a more unified policy, whether it's at a state level or a national level? What are your thoughts on policy in general when it comes to water? Do you think it has to come at that state level and be hyper regional, localized or regionalized, or do you think that there can be something done at a national level to fuel that kind of a policy and culture change?
Yeah, I think there's most of it should be done, in states and in agreements like you had mentioned the Colorado River, which we
Mhm.
have compacts between the various states. So I think a state approach is best. But a lot of these issues, like the feds manage our Central Valley project, so the federal government has a role, and there's been change. There's been recent changes in federal policy towards water, releasing more for agricultural uses. That's been the focus of this current administration, and that might change, with the new administration. So there's definitely a role the feds can play, but I think a state role is a more valid one, and a lot of the localities have been able to come up with solutions that are helpful. I had mentioned, Orange County with their dive into wastewater recycling, which had typically had an ick factor, the whole toilet to tap idea. Now, as water's become more of a problem, then some of that factor, which is really purely psychological, has been going away. But people tend not to. You're right. People tend not to worry about water as long as the water's coming out of the tap and their water bills aren't so high. I mean, in Santa Barbara years ago, out of concerns about growth, didn't want to tap into the state water project. And then, sure enough, after an extremely severe drought, voters approved the bond that allowed the region to tap into the state water project. So we're hoping that it doesn't take extensive droughts for people to recognize that maybe their thinking their thinking has to change. But interesting enough, and in California, most of the water falls in the top 1/3 of the state, obviously, but some of the most arid regions have done the best job preparing for drought. During our last drought, the San Diego Water Authority had so much water that it was just dumping water out of their reservoirs, and it just was an example to me, and I discuss it in the book of how planning and good engineering and good planning can provide enough water, wherein some of the more rainy areas of our state where there's been less planning and less storage. Also talk about the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta, which is always the big issue here in California, because it's the Sacramento River runs into the West Coast's largest estuary, which is like 1,000 miles of waterways. And it's kind of like one water official I quote talks about being like a 6-lane super highway that runs into a handful of dirt paths and then has to come out at the other end onto another highway. And it's just tangled. And there had been a proposal years ago to build a peripheral canal to take water around the periphery of the Delta. Right now, the pumps at the south end of the Delta often are stopped over concerns about the Delta smelt and endangered bait-sized fish. if you get one of those caught in the pumps, they shut down the pump. So there's been a plan, uh, originally 2 tunnels, now down to 1 tunnel, to tunnel underneath the delta and just make a more reliable supply of water through that bottleneck. So there are a lot of issues that aren't just purely about storage, but are about how to move the water around more efficiently. And I have a chapter on pricing. I mean, some like Australia has adopted a pricing system, and I'm a critic of how a lot of it's done, and I describe that in detail in the book. But pricing is a good way to assure that things get to the highest and best use. I mean, if we price things appropriately, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about water or anything else. It's going to get bought and sold and go to the places that it's needed the most. But right now, I show a picture of the state's decision tree for deciding when to approve a water transfer. It's one of these Rube Goldberg like contraptions where you go from here to here to here to here. You can't buy it. Would you buy and sell a stock if if it took months and months of government approval before you'd be allowed to do it? So there are a lot of regulatory reforms that I discuss in the book that could help move what's there, but it all has to be done against the backdrop of the political system trying to find ways to get more water into the system. And I think Metropolitan Water District calls it the big gulp, little sip. So when there's a big rainy years, you just try to take a little extra water out and store it. And I have a chapter on a variety of the specific infrastructure projects that might be considered. Raising Shasta Dam. That dam was designed to be 200 feet taller than it is now, and there was a plan to boost it by 18.5 feet, which would provide an enormous amount of water without having to dam any other rivers. We're just talking about there are a lot of little things. They're not little, but smaller targeted infrastructure improvements that could help assure enough water in dry years.
Yeah. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on too is what I was flipping through the book and I saw this one poll quote about how the funding follows crises. And I was like, that is so absolutely true. And especially when it comes to California, you mentioned the drought. And as you start to pull out of droughts, the concern about this water issue falls away. It's like, how do you keep, what are going to be the strategies that'll be needed to ensure that you keep the eyeballs on the issue, even during moments when it's not a critical problem?
Well, that's always the problem in anything that's generally driven by government, and water system is driven by government, and voters often have a final say. So people aren't that concerned. In an ideal world, we build the projects using revenue bonds, things that are paid for, the capital improvements that are paid for by the end users over a certain period of time. And then what happens is we don't build enough of those projects, and then we have a drought, and then create a water bond that has all sorts of pork barrel projects, and we pay for it with general fund revenues. It's just hard. It's just hard when you're trying to plan long term, and droughts come and droughts go, and we're stuck with a political system that's stuck in these binaries, fighting over how much water we're gonna flush down the Tuolumne River to save a dozen fish at the cost of, I don't know, $170,000 a fish, when we could buy the same fish for $6.99 a pound at the grocery store. So I don't know that we could totally get around that, but it would be helpful if if our politicians had more of a plan, and we had in the past, right? Governor Pat Brown, Jerry Brown's father, was renowned for helping build not just the water infrastructure, but our transportation infrastructure, and making that a priority. And I quote a lot from a lot of old state documents, and it's just the mentality between the 50s and the 60s, and this idea that we could just go and build anything we want, to the mentality now where doing an environmental impact report would take longer than it took to build most of the state water projects. I'm not arguing for a total return to that, but a little more of that can-do attitude, and a little more of a focus on providing extra water, and recognizing that, you know, some of the activists really would like to see a world of scarcity and rationing, and that hurts the poor the most. And our state has the largest percentage of poor people if you use the Census Bureau's cost of living adjusted measure, and we keep embracing policies that add costs to the basic cost of living here. And water is you know, a basic cost of living item.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a challenging problem to solve, and we appreciate you taking the time to talk a little bit more about it. For everyone who's watching, you can read a lot more about this in his book, Winning the Water Wars. Thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us today, and we appreciate you having you on the call.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it.